Okay, so I assume you can see my my slides, right? So I'm going to give you a very broad overview. And this is like my goal here is to get you thinking about these things, to change how you read the newspaper, like basically to change how you read the New York Times every day, and then to sort of spark your interest in doing this stuff for the long haul. So let me see. Okay. Yeah. So why am I doing this? Well, I'm a professor at Hunter College. I'm a development and behavioral microeconomist. And what that means is that a lot of my research is motivated by questions of economic development. And the way that I address those questions is using tools from microeconomic theory. And I often combine those tools with insights from psychology. And I'll kind of give you a taste of all of those things today. So let me first clear up some misconceptions. Now, I imagine that since you are all interested in economics and are probably already thinking about stuff, you don't have these misconceptions, but it's still something worth clarifying. So at its core, economics is not the study of the economy per se. It's not the study of the stock market or interest rates or tax rates or so on. And it's also not a set of conclusions. So often when you read like the newspapers, you might think, oh, economists say that governments should leave markets alone. But you should not think of economics as just being fixated on the economy and just having prescriptions on the economy. Instead, think of economics as a kind of social science. It's a way of organizing our thoughts about the world around us. And this method that we use in economics, it's not easy. It takes a lot of time to acquire like the skills, but the emphasis is on simplification and logic. And we keep things very simple, and then we try to apply this approach to thinking about the world to the economy, of course. A lot of what we study is the economy, but we also think about politics and international relations, corruption, crime, personal procrastination, discrimination, and so on. So there's a lot of stuff you can think about using these same tools, which is what makes it very powerful. So what are these tools? What's the method? Well, the first thing we do is when we think about people, we strip them down to the basics. So imagine that individuals have to choose. So we can't have everything, right? Because we have limited resources. We have limited time, we have limited money, we have limited attention. So that's the start of economics. We have to think about how we make choices. And what we assume is that generally, even if it's not always the case, that generally we make these choices rationally. And what that means is that we think about our goals, we understand our goals, and then we pursue them to the extent possible, given our limited resources. And right here, let me dispel another misconception. Our goals are not just limited to our own private consumption. We can totally have goals that include concerns for others, concerns for the environment, ethical behavior, and so on. And all of those objectives can be analyzed using the same approach. So once we think about these individuals as these atoms of the system, we then play around with what would happen if you place these atoms in different settings. So we say, what would happen if you put buyers and sellers together in markets? What would happen in negotiations between parents and children within households? How will countries that are facing off over a contested border decide when to use force and when not to use force? It's all of these kinds of things that you can start to think about using this very simple framework. So this, especially to economists, this method is very attractive. And that's because we keep things really simple and logical. And by keeping things so minimal, we often discover like very counterintuitive mechanisms at play. And that's kind of the exciting thing about doing econ, where you're thinking about something, you're thinking, why does X happen? And then you say, let me try the simplest possible storytelling about what's going on. And then in that simplicity, you suddenly discover stuff. And that's how we advance our knowledge. And also, because our models are so simple, what we can do is we can work backwards. So suppose you have a model that says that markets are efficient, right? So the basic model of competitive markets says that the outcome will be efficient, which means that, broadly speaking, which means that the societal pie will be maximized. If we're trying to maximize the amount available to consume altogether, the competitive markets will deliver that. But then you go out in the real world, right? And you see, well, there's many cases where the outcomes just don't look efficient. They look quite bad in many different ways. Not only are they highly unequal, it just seems like we are not even maximizing the size of the pie. So then what we do in economics is we know that we messed something up when we were setting up our initial story of the world, that initial model. So you can sort of go backwards and then build alternative models about how the world really works until you start to get it right. And so development economics is a lot of this, is a lot of like starting out with the standard model and then saying, oh, wait, there's so many bad outcomes in so many parts of the world. There's so much poverty and so much inequality. Why is that happening? There must be something that we didn't anticipate in our initial model of the world. And then you think about it. Okay. So let me first show you some pictures to sort of motivate how we might start to think about development economics and why it's an important field. So first of all, look at this one. So what I have here on the x-axis is I have a timeline from 1960 to the present. Okay. And on the y-axis, I have the per capita income in various countries, which is the average income earned in, so the income earned by the average person in a given year in these countries. Okay, so let's first look at the red curve, which is the United States. And you can see that the US in 1960 started out fairly well off, or it was already quite well off by international standards, but then it's had a meteoric rise in per capita income. So the US, for a rich country, has had an astoundingly high level of growth. And today it's one of the richest countries in the world. It's up here. But then what's maybe probably more interesting is that in 1960s, you had a bunch of other countries that were starting out in states of relative poverty with very, very low per capita incomes. So like these are all per capita incomes well under $1,000 a year. So the average person earning less than $1,000 a year. And the countries that I've mapped out here are South Korea, Mexico, India, Pakistan, and Nigeria. And this is the kind of thing, when you look at it, the big questions emerge. They all started out in the same place. And yet, look at Korea today. Korea is an extremely advanced nation in terms of basic measures of income. Mexico is somewhat advanced. It's done reasonably well. But then look at a bunch of other countries like India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and there's a lot of examples like this of countries where, at least if you look at a chart like this, they've just fallen way behind. So what did some countries do to do so much better than others? But now I want to also clarify something else. Even though this, like the India, Pakistan, Nigeria stuff looks very flat, it's actually like there have been a lot of changes in those countries as well. So let me just take one particular example. Let's take India. And this is very hard to see, but this is basically the way the World Bank describes extreme poverty is people who live on less than $2.15 a day. So think about living on $2.15 a day in the US. There's very, very few people in the US today who live on that. So we would say that the extreme poverty in the US is close to zero. There's a lot of poverty in the US, but there's very little extreme poverty. But take India, for example. In 1978, extreme poverty, more than 60% of the population was in extreme poverty. But over the years, you see a very steady decline. In the early 1990s, India initiated a lot of reforms, and then the decline started happening even faster. And you can see that extreme poverty has now dropped to less than 10% of the population. So even though on the growth chart, India didn't seem to be doing as a lot of other countries, within these very poor countries, there have been dramatic reductions, at least in the most extreme forms of poverty. This is just interesting ways to chop up the data. And we don't have to look at development. This is where I used to live till a few years ago in the Lower East Side. Look at the corner of Essex and Delancey in 2014 when I lived there, and look at the corner of Essex and Delancey today. These are dramatic changes that you see in the economic environment around you in the space of just a few years. So we want to think about like where these changes come about from. So at this point, you might have one objection, and especially a lot of people who sort of instinctively dislike economics, they do have an objection that we economists tend to think too much about money and consumption. What about the other stuff that we care about? There's a lot of other things that we should be concerned about that constitutes a good life and constitutes a healthy life, right? Well, one of the reasons that we think that we often focus on money is that money correlates with other things that we care about as well. So look at this particular chart. On this chart, on the x-axis, we are looking at different levels of per capita incomes across different countries. And on the y-axis, we are looking at life expectancy at birth. So you might say, well, we are more interested in health than in just money for its own sake. And what you see right here is that as countries get richer, the average life expectancy in a country also grows quite steadily. Now, beyond a point, the life expectancy doesn't seem to correlate that much with income, which is an interesting thing too. So if a country's per capita income crosses, say, like $35,000 a year or $40,000 a year, you don't really see a relationship between income and life expectancy. But at least initially you do. Or you could say, well, what about overall well-being? Like how good people feel about their own lives. So look at this. On the x-axis, you have how rich a country is. And on the y-axis, you have people's self-reported life satisfaction. How satisfied are you? And again, look at this. As countries get richer, the average person reports a much higher level of life satisfaction. So if we want to allow people to have their own notions of what it is to have a good life, even those notions you see are very dependent on the amount of money that is being earned in a country. So when we focus on money, it's not because we think that money is a good in itself, but because we understand that money is a very easy way to measure things, and that really correlates with all these other things that we might care more about. So now development. So what do we do with this stuff? So the kinds of questions we ask is, why are some countries poor? Why do some countries grow fast and why do others grow slow? What do we do about inequality? What does it mean to be poor? What does it mean to have developed as a country, and so on? And in all of these things, we are going to be using one disciplining device. And this, I think, is a very nice thing about economics. We try to explain these differences across countries by thinking about the differences in the economic systems or the environments that we inhabit. We don't like to appeal to individual characteristics. So we don't want to say, oh, population X is poor because they are lazy, or economy Y is not doing well because the people who live in that country are all corrupt. We don't like to appeal to just directly to culture or personal characteristics. We like to think about everyone as broadly the same and then stuck in different settings doing different things. So to give you an example, I spent a few years doing fieldwork in some pretty remote parts of Indonesia. And one of the places that we went, there was this village that was known as the robbers village, where like people around us basically said that, oh, those people are all known as thieves. And as a result, they get penalized by the government. So they don't have any roads. So they have to walk half an hour through fields to get to the main road. They don't have access to business opportunities and so on. So now one way to think about it is to say, oh, those people are naturally thieves, so they don't deserve any services. But the way an economist would start thinking about this is instead by saying, you know what, they're probably, if at all the data shows that they do engage in more higher rates of robbery than other communities, first you have to check the data. If that's what the data shows, it's very likely because they have been cut off from the economy as opposed to anything else. So you always want to think about the state that people find themselves in rather than just attributing their outcomes to their innate characteristics. Okay. Now, so let's first think very, very big picture. Okay. So this is like, so suppose you were to do some macroeconomics and you wanted to have a broad sense of how the economy works. This is how you would do it. So you would say, by the way, can you see when I move my mouse around, can you see it? Okay, good. So suppose you, so let's just imagine that an economy consists of two entities. There's a bunch of firms and a bunch of households, okay? Firms have a stock of capital that they use to produce goods. So they use their capital to produce stuff that households will consume. So the way that it works is that firms produce this stuff, households pay the firms for this stuff, firms make profits, and firms' profits and wages to households go back to households in terms of money. So basically the cycle of money is that firms will pay households wages and profits. Households will use that money to buy stuff from firms. Firms will keep producing stuff and selling it back to households. So this is sort of this infinite cycle you can imagine yourselves in. But in this story, you're not going to see any growth. And the reason you don't see any growth in this story is that firms have a certain amount of capital that they use to produce stuff. This capital stock is not growing. So how do we change this to think about growth? There's a missing piece in that story. What we add is the possibility of savings. So now we introduce this idea that households don't have to spend all their income on consumer goods. Some of that income could be channeled off into savings. And that savings goes through the banking system, it goes through the venture capital system, et cetera, and it gets converted into investment. So people save their money, other investors borrow that money, and they end up buying more capital for firms. So this way, now every year, if on average, households save a little bit, not everyone has to save, some people might be borrowing, but if on average, the economy saves a little bit, that savings can lead to a larger capital stock the next year. And that is what is going to create a cycle of growth, because every year you'll have more capital. That means your productive capacity grows for the next year as well. Okay. So now a few general points about working with growth models. Like one is a person who made a lot of contributions to the theory of growth is Solow. And Solow's observation was that you can't have endless growth, and that's because of diminishing marginal products. What that means is that you can't just keep throwing capital into the economy and expect that the economy will continue to grow. At some point, the capital is going to be kind of redundant and useless because you can't just keep increasing output indefinitely. So the way to get around this is through improving our technologies, through research and development. And as we learn to use so what you want to do to generate growth is you want to keep investing in capital, and you want to keep improving the technologies you have about how to use that capital. And that is the way that you would generate growth in an economy. So one example of how we improve technologies is what was called the Green Revolution in the 1960s, where basically, like, it was an agronomist named Norman Borlaug actually who started this, but then there were a lot of other scientists involved, where they basically figured out ways to dramatically increase agricultural output using the same amount of land. And that played a huge role in reducing poverty all over the developing world. So now let's say keep this broad story of growth in your mind. Okay, so we have to save. That savings goes into investment, and then that increased investment can lead to more output. So then we could ask, well, then why do some countries grow slower than others? Well, if you look at that model, what you basically have to guess is maybe some countries grow slowly because they have lower levels of productivity. They have a harder time converting their capital into output. Or maybe some countries grow slower because they save less on average. Or maybe some countries grow slower because investors have a harder time tapping into those savings in order to invest in more capital. So now that we have these hypotheses that come out of that basic story, we could go in a micro direction. So we can start to think about very, very narrow real world settings where these kinds of stories could be fleshed out. And then we start to understand, these are the possible things that can create underdevelopment at the entire economy-wide level. Okay, so let's go to that. So now I'm going to go micro. Any questions for me right now? I can't see everyone, but you can even you can put questions in the chat also if you want to, and I'll try to take a look at that sometimes. Okay. So now I'm going to give you just a bunch of examples, okay? So the first one is and each of these examples is going to relate to these 3 points. So I want you to keep in mind, we're thinking about why is there low productivity? Why is there low savings? Why might there be difficulty borrowing? So the first one is what's called coordination failure. And this is a very big, this could be a very big deal. So entirely rational people could end up stuck with inferior technologies unless everyone can coordinate to adopt them together. So what this means is that you could have 2 populations, A and B, and they could end up doing very differently, even though the people are basically the same. So think about it this way. Imagine population A, where everyone has a telephone, and everyone has already bought a telephone, and they use this to communicate with each other and to basically improve their lives. In population B, no one has a phone. And even though they started out essentially the same. So population B is worse off than population A, but not through any fault of their own, in a sense, because each person in population B is behaving rationally. So think about it yourselves. Suppose you were all in population B, and suppose no one else had a phone. Would it make sense for you to buy a phone, to put in that money to buy a phone? It would not, because there's no one that you would be able to speak to with that phone. So you can see that entirely rational people could get stuck in bad outcomes because they cannot make that coordinated move to the better outcome. And if you cannot make that coordinated move, you could have entire populations stuck with lower productivity. So to give you one very real world example, there was this study in the Indian state of Kerala. And in the state of Kerala, it's a coastal state. And what used to happen is basically you have a lot of fishermen who go out fishing, and then they have to decide which port to get back to sell their stock at the end of the day. So now, if there's no communication, fishermen will often end up like there might be too many fishermen at some ports and too few at others, which basically would lead to messed up markets, because you don't know where the others have gone. Some people might have gone to market X, others might have gone to market Y, and so on. So then what you want is for everyone to have a cell phone. And if everyone has a cell phone on the port and the fishermen, then they can communicate data on where are there too many people selling already, where are there too few people. And then everyone could be made better off by allocating the fish better. But it doesn't make sense for just one person to have a cell phone because they can't get information from others. So what happened in Kerala was that at some point there was a coordinated move where everyone started to acquire these cell phones, and then everyone's outcomes improve. But these coordinated moves are often very hard to achieve until the technology becomes sufficiently cheap, or until there's a government that can help you out with this. So now another thing. Another possible issue that can lead to low productivity is weak property rights. So take a look at this picture. This picture is from the marketplace in the neighborhood in Delhi where I grew up. And this is what it looks like today. So you've got a lot of sort of like semi-built up stores. So the commercial areas are all sort of semi-built up. There's a lot of like ambiguous property rights. People aren't quite sure if they own their property or not. They're not quite sure if their construction is legal or not, because the Indian legal code on constructions is very complex and very ambiguous, and so on. So what you see is that a lot of stores end up underinvesting in their own long run upkeep. And that's what you see in this picture. It's a very haphazard and ramshackle setup. And you might ask, well, why don't they make optimal investments for their own to maximize their own long run output, to maximize the potential for sales and so on in the long run? Well, the reason that a lot of firms might not make these optimal incentives is because they're not quite sure when this property will be taken away from them, when the government might send bulldozers to break these stores down. So if you're uncertain about whether you really own your property or not, you're going to underinvest. And if people generally underinvest in their property, again, you're not maximizing the economic potential from the resources that you have. Another big one is the problem of asymmetric information. So look at this picture. I just went to Google Images and I plugged in a basic search. I said used car seller. And when you plug in used car seller, look at the pictures that show up right away. This is the first set of pictures that shows up. Many of these pictures are of somewhat suspicious looking men who are probably trying to cheat you, right? Like that's the idea that you get here. And in fact, the used car market has this sort of reputation where we don't really trust used cars. So and why might that be the case? So what we have is that when information is asymmetric, when different people have different kinds of information and not everyone knows everything, you can have total collapses of markets. So let's imagine that there's lots of people who want to buy used cars and lots of people who want to sell their used cars, okay? But the sellers who want to sell their used cars, all of their cars look the same to me as a potential buyer. I can't make out which used car is in good shape, which one is in bad shape. There's a lot of hidden stuff in there. So I see 4 cars lined up in the used car lot, right? So, and let's say that I know from my general information that one of those cars is going to be worth 2,000. One of those cars will be worth 4,000. One will be worth 6,000. One will be worth 8,000. But everyone has like polished up and painted up their cars. So there's no way for me to know which is which. And in fact, if I go to a particular seller and I ask, how much is your car worth? They will just have an incentive to lie and say, my car is worth 8,000. Right? So now I, as a buyer, think, well, what's the average quality of these cars? Because there's no way I'm paying more than the average quality. And I say, well, the average quality of these cars is probably 5,000. So I'm paying no more than $5,000 for a car, and I'll pick a car at random. But if the buyers are all paying just are willing to pay only $5,000 for these cars, think about what happens. If you are one of the sellers who had a car that was worth 6,000 or 8,000, you might say, you know what, it's not worth it for me to sell a car at my car at 5,000. I'm just going to drive it for a few more years myself. So you walk away from the market. But so when the good cars walk away from the market, we're left with just the cars that were worth less than we could pay for them. So then consumers rethink and they say, you know what? That means that the only cars that are available are actually the ones that are worth 2,000 and 4,000. So I'm only willing to pay 3,000. I'm not willing to pay 5,000. I'm only willing to pay the average of these two. So the maximum a typical buyer will pay now is 3,000. Then the person who had the car worth 4,000 says, this is not worth it. I'm walking away. So then what you end up with at the end of the day is that only the worst used cars will survive in the market, and people will be willing to pay very little for them. And all these other potential traits that could have made both sides better off. I really want a good used car. You have a good used car that you would love to sell to me, but we can't agree on those traits because there's no way that I can figure out that you are the one with the good car versus someone else who's got the bad car. So when you don't have a free flow of information, you can have total markets collapsing where a lot of stuff just doesn't get exchanged. So if you want to read about this, read this paper by Akerlof called The Market for Lemons. It's all going to be on the slides. It's a very accessible paper, and it's kind of the idea that got Akerlof the Nobel Prize in economics some years ago. And here's a picture. This is not a picture of my first car, but it's the model of the first car that we bought. So when I was very young in the 1980s in Delhi, we went and bought an Ambassador, which is what these cars are, from a used car salesperson. And the car broke down on us when we were driving it home from the store. So we had to walk home that day. So I also have personal experience with the dangers of these things. Now, it's very different in the US now because we have a lot more data in used car markets. So used car markets in the US are not like that, but that's the idea. Okay. So there's other things also that can cause. And so now I'm going to turn a little bit behavioral for this example. So I'll use a little bit of psychology. One thing that can prevent individuals from making the best economic decisions, from being fully productive, is if they're preoccupied with other stuff. So if I am constantly stressed out about where my next meal is coming from, I'm going to have a very hard time thinking about how to optimally grow my business. It's a very basic fact about our brain capacity that economists have for a long time ignored. Economists typically assume, oh, we just optimize everything. We do the best for ourselves. But it's not possible to do that if you're really stressed out about basic things like feeding your family. So if you want to read more about this, you should read this book by Mulainathan and Shafir called Scarcity. It's a super interesting book. It's a really enjoyable read. But on a related note, let me tell you about an example of a study that was carried out. And if you Google the cake versus salad study, you'll find this very quickly. Basically, what these authors did, it's Shiv and Federican did this study. They brought a bunch of students into a classroom, and they said, hey, we want you to memorize this number and then walk over to the next classroom, deliver the number, walk down the hall to the next classroom, deliver the number, and then you'll get a reward and you can be on your way. And basically what they did was some people were asked to memorize a 2-digit number, and some people were asked to memorize a 7-digit number. Okay. And 7-digit numbers are easy to memorize, but you have to keep repeating them in your head, right? When you're walking down to the next room. Now, as the students were walking down from room A to room B, along in the hallway, they were stopped and said, hey, just quick question. Tell us what reward you want at the end of the experiment so that we can have it ready for you. Would you like a slice of chocolate cake or would you like a fruit salad? And what the study finds is that people who were memorizing the 2-digit number were much more likely to choose the fruit salad than people who are memorizing the 7-digit number. So this suggests that if your brain is occupied in repeating those 7 digits to yourself, you don't have the space in your brain to do your long-run optimization. You don't have the space in your brain to exercise self-control. So you end up indulging by having the slice of chocolate cake, even though you know that in general you shouldn't be doing that. So memorizing big numbers means you end up making less than optimal decisions for yourself. Now translate that into the real world situations where you're struggling tomorrow and think about how those things would translate. Another example of why, now, okay, so those were all issues that are about why there might be low productivity in general. Now let's think about why people in some places might not save as much as in other places. One thing that could lead to people saving less than in other places is if there's a lower level of financial literacy. And if people are generally undereducated, that will also be, it'll also be the case that they're going to have slightly lower levels of financial literacy, right? This is a chart from a study that I did, but it's not really from my data, but I just want to give you a sense of this. So one of the things that people have a really hard time with is compound interest. So if you save your money in the bank at a 10% annual compound interest rate, which means that you earn interest on your interest every year. So what you would get over 20 years is that if you started out with $1, with interest, that amount would grow very dramatically over 20 years with compound interest. But we often suffer from what in the profession is called exponential growth bias, where we don't fully comprehend the nature of this growth. So what many of us do is we sort of think our money will grow according to this blue line, which is closer to simple interest than to compound interest. And if we fail to understand this, what's called the magic of compound interest, we are going to be less incentivized to save our money. And if we are less incentivized to save our money because the returns don't look as attractive, then the net result is also going to be lower levels of investment in the economy. So that's another thing to think about. And yet another thing to think about, this is challenges to borrowing. So now imagine on the other end, imagine on the investor end, imagine that you are a small business or you're an investor and you want to borrow some money in order to invest in something. Well, how does lending work? A bank in the US is going to look at your credit history. It's going to determine whether you in general have been able to repay loans in the past. It's also going to threaten that if you don't repay this particular loan, then your credit history will get worse. That's kind of how lending works in the US. But in a developing country, if you don't have credit histories, then there is no way for a lender to distinguish between people who are generally safe prospects and people who are risky prospects, right? So, and then in order to hedge their own risk, a lender is going to have to lend at very, very high interest rates. So imagine, like, let's say, let's take a developing country without this credit history system. And let's say there's two people who go to the bank for a loan. And let's say, and two people who want to start a business. Let's say there's one person who actually has very good business sense. And let's say the other person is me, where I have very poor business sense. And I know that like I would probably like make any business collapse. Now, the two of us go to the bank and we both ask for a loan of like $10,000 to start a business. I have no idea which of us is good and which of us is bad because we don't have a paper trail behind us. One of you is good, one of you is bad on average. So I'm just going to have to charge you a very high interest rate because I need to cover my losses from whoever is not that good. So what happens is that without these credit histories, interest rates can really shoot up. And I've done research where I've seen that the poor, like people like vegetable vendors on the street, they often borrow at interest rates of 10% a day. And if your poverty is, okay, so whoever's going to listen to this recording is going to miss that key sentence in the middle. And okay, so yeah, so suppose the only way out of poverty is to borrow a little bit. You're not going to be able to do that. So now, this was obviously just a snapshot of various things. There's many, many other things that we can think about in developing. But once we identify these kinds of problems in development, we can start to think about solutions. So if we say, so now I have a better sense of why markets collapse, why people are underproductive, why some people borrow less than others, some people can't borrow, why some people save less than others, and so on. So if you understand the root causes of certain problems, then you can start to devise solutions. And a lot of designing economic policy is trying to think about these solutions. And what you can also do is you can run what are called randomized experiments to test the effectiveness of these solutions. So let's take a broad area. So there's been a lot of research in thinking about savings and borrowing in developing countries. And especially today, there have been, like you see, like if you read about like randomized controlled trials or randomized experiments, you'll see that there's a ton of work going on where people are testing out new innovations to see if they can be used to improve people's access to saving and borrowing. And in fact, a lot of this kind of research was pioneered by some of my professors in graduate school, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, who in fact, they won the Nobel Prize in economics just a few years ago for their work in building and designing these kinds of experiments. So it's a really big thing. And if you decide to if you end up going to do a PhD in economics, you'll find that now there's a lot of graduate students who run these kinds of very, very large scale experiments as well. So one of the innovations of the last few decades has been microfinance. Microfinance is a way to try and get around these problems of zero credit histories. So what microfinance does is it says, if we don't have credit histories in the marketplace, let's try and build them ourselves. Let's try and use repeated lending to people so that we ourselves can build credit histories associated with various individuals. Another thing that microfinance does is it says, how do we incentivize people to repay their loans that in ways that the regular market cannot? Well, one is through this repeated lending, but another thing is through group lending. So what they do is a lot of microfinance contracts are ones where each of us is responsible for each other's loans as well in small groups. And if we are all responsible for each other's loans, that creates sort of an internal monitoring mechanism that gets us all to operate more responsibly so that our loans get repaid. And the net result of all of this is that borrowers, especially very poor borrowers, can suddenly start to get loans at much lower interest rates than they would get in the general marketplace outside microfinance. So microfinance has the potential to do a lot of good. But there's also the potential to do bad in the sense that it could leave people with greater debt burdens and so on. And so there's been a lot of experimental work that tries to study what's good about microfinance and what's not so good. And if you Google this, or if you go, one very useful thing to do is to go into Google Scholar. Go into Google Scholar and just like punch in keywords that you're interested in, and you get a ton of stuff that's really cool. Another thing to keep in mind, and this is the last story I want to tell you, is that sometimes the access to savings and borrowing is not about money, but it's about goods. It's about just stuff. And this is a study that my friend Maisie Wong and I did in Eastern Indonesia. So Indonesia in recent years has done very well for itself economically, or relatively well, but there's still very poor parts of the country. So the place that we went to was the island of Timor, and it was the West Timor is a part of Indonesia, which is still quite poor. And one of the challenges that we had there was to think about the fact that even though it's a resource-rich island, people in Timor, there's a long anthropological literature on how people in Timor have a predictable famine season every year, where even though they have a lot of output, they're somehow not able to make it last over the course of the year. So in a sense, what you could think of is as a savings problem. So a lot of households grow maize, which they grow corn, and corn is very, very good for the health. Like it covers a lot of bases in terms of your nutritional needs. So suppose you're a family that grows a lot of corn. Think of that as your asset. You have to somehow make that last over the course of the whole year. Well, what typically households in Timor used to do is what you see in the picture on the left. They would basically blacken their corn over a fire and then hang it from the roofs of their huts. So the idea behind blackening their corn is that you want to dehydrate it. And if you dehydrate it, you can kind of make it last a little bit longer. So it's less susceptible to various forms of damage. But still, that's not a foolproof solution at all. There's a lot of infestation, a lot of just like insects and vermin eat up their corn. A lot of it just goes bad and so on. So the way to think about this in an economic sense is to think of this as a starting asset on which they earn a negative interest rate. If you save this asset, if you save some of this asset at the start of the year, at the end of the year, you have less than what you started out with. So it's basically you're earning a negative interest rate. So the challenge that we faced over there was, how can we try and give people access to technologies that could improve their interest rates on savings from something that's negative to something that is at least zero? You can't make their asset grow, but can they at least save it so that there's enough for them to consume during the lean season? And our basic intervention was very simple. We started to import basic storage technologies that were waterproof and airtight. And these storage technologies, the idea is that they can change your interest rate from something negative to zero. So they give you a dramatically increased interest rate, which can increase the total amount of assets that you have, which then in turn can increase your productive capacity in other ways. If you have more food during the lean season, you have more energy. If you have more energy, you're able to be more productive and you can work your way out of poverty and so on. So the results of the study were kind of subtle and complex. They weren't exactly what we were expecting, which is another very interesting thing when you do these kinds of experimental studies. But this was the idea behind how we set things up. Okay, so that's it. That's a bunch of stories that I had, and I think if you are interested in thinking about this stuff further, maybe go back to my slides and remember the sort of the order in which I told you this, because I think the order matters. And then you can think about diverging in other directions. You might say, you know what, I have experience from my travels or from my family in a certain part of the world where there's this other issue. And I wonder why that's the case. Could any of these stories explain that other phenomenon? If not, could there be another explanation of why that particular market doesn't function very well? And then you go to Google and Google around to see if others have thought about that. And if not, you have a research topic. You can tell a story. You can try to tell a story about why something bad happens. And then you can, when you go to college, you can start to look for data, to dig around and say, could I look for data that could somehow validate why this happens at all? So yeah, and if you want to think more, if you want to reach out to me with questions about what you could read or something, of course, you can always do that. You can go to my website. I also have like other resources that I put up for my students, which you might enjoy. And I see that one of the things that I put up there is something that Lena has listed in the chat. So yeah, so that was it. I'm done. Ask me anything you like.